No, you can stay standing. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone who's here. Got a few people online as well. Thanks for joining us. So today's speaker for our departmental seminar is Elena Frogameni, who's coming to us from the University of Oxford, but I think more importantly, coming to us from the Department of Politics. So it's a great chance for some interdisciplinary conversation, learn about what Elena's been thinking about language from politics side. Hopefully the linguists in the room have some interesting questions as well to get some conversation going. So thank you for coming and presenting, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Joey. Thank you to everyone for coming. I'm super excited to be here. My name's Elena. I'm a DPhil candidate in politics at the University of Oxford. I'm supervised by Dr. Stathis Kalivas. As Joey mentioned, I am totally not a linguist, and I have absolutely no background in linguistics. So it makes this mildly intimidating, but also really exciting to get to talk to people who work on language. And I'm really excited to share with you today some of my sort of initial conceptual work into the role of language and conflict through the political science perspective. See if this works. Yeah. So my main goal today is to first give an overview into what I think is the really exciting interdisciplinary research agenda of language conflicts. And then sort of two, to present my initial theoretical work around the role of language in conflicts, and some of my application of that theory to the case of Cameroon's Anglophone crisis. Hopefully today I'll leave you with the message that language matters a lot to states, and because of that, it can and often has become a precipitator of violent conflict around the world. So this might be familiar to those of you who work on language conflicts, but broadly, what is it? You've probably heard of the more common terms in political science and in journalism of religious conflict or ethnic conflict. And both of these terms, like language conflict, highlight the dimensions of grievance, so what people are fighting about, and identity, who people are in conflicts. But there's been really little study from the perspective of politics around an identity dimension that we often see or perceive of as going hand in hand with ethnic conflict or religious conflicts, but really don't study on its own, and that's language. And so to quote Stanley Dubinsky, who is someone who's done really great work into pioneering this field of language conflict studies, folks who work on language conflict seek to advance our understanding of ways in which language differences and policies correlate with the onset, escalation, persistence, and de-escalation of conflicts. In my own research, I'm really interested in what makes language conflict unique. So what is the unique role of language in intrastate violent conflicts? I'm interested in who and what are sort of the motivators and the mediators of language conflicts, and also how do states respond either effectively or, more often than not effectively in language conflicts. So within the field of political science, I would say there's not fantastic sort of motivation of studying language conflict, and we've had a few roadblocks in the fields. One of those is really limited and often contradictory studies within sort of quantitative studies around whether language even matters at all. Over time, you've had folks like David Layton sort of saying, well, language actually doesn't cause conflict. Multilingualism can really help conflict. You have people like Elena who say, well, fractionalization on an ethnic dimension, language dimension are really the same thing. But then you have really interesting studies like Neil Borman's, which says that language and religion are really both great predictors of whether we see violent conflicts. There's also not been a ton of conclusions sort of as to what conditions cause language conflict. So Ishida's study in 2006 tried to look at, do we see language conflict in which sort of state scenarios and which sort of policy scenarios? And unfortunately, the answer to that was, we're not sure, inconclusive. Also sort of facing the challenge of disciplinary silos, and it's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here today. There's amazing work happening in linguistics and sociolinguistics around sort of how does language matter, when does it matter? In political science, we've got great work on conflict studies and conflict emergence and area studies. We've got a lot of great research into historical patterns and history of colonization and how that's manifested with language conflict, but not a lot of talking together to create a larger theory. And then we have the sort of ever-present question that I get asked when I present to political science folks, which is language conflict even a thing? Isn't this just ethnic conflicts? Isn't language just ethnicity? Does this matter? And I see this as sort of one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the field. Political science and conflict studies often think about language just as an expression of ethnicity and sort of one of these most salient dimensions of an expression. I see this as both analytical risk, so assuming this one-to-one ethnicity to language relationship is both historically accurate. We have cases around the globe where multiple ethnicities claim attachment to the same language, or also ignores the reality of multilingualism, that in a lot of these conflict scenarios, we have folks practicing in their daily lives multiple languages and not representing strong attachment to necessarily one or the other. But I think more importantly, and again, this is where you say, like, my research is really important. I think we've got a lot of precision failure when we're unable to examine specific conflict precipitating mechanisms of language policy and language conflict. So that sort of brings me to dealing with current gaps in the fields. I'm curious about where we see language conflict and what it represents. The thing is, we don't have a clear answer, and neither do I, but hopefully I'll get there in a few years. Language diversity doesn't seem to determine language conflicts. We have a lot of multilingual realities which don't see violent conflict at all. And one of the ones people cite a lot in the field is Switzerland, right? Sort of this model for being able to have multilingualism where conflict doesn't really emerge. Nor does lack of language diversity. So we have cases where you have two really strong language groups where sometimes you see conflict, sometimes you don't. Another example of that is sort of in the US context. We've got a ton of Spanish speakers, one of the largest sort of second language groups in the US, but you don't see a lot of movements for language rights or that devolving into protest. Also, language policy doesn't seem to determine language conflict. We've got cases where we've got official bilingualism, tons of sort of official rights, and we still see violent conflict. We've got cases where there's sort of no language policy at all, not a great predictor. And then we also have this sort of challenge that we see language conflicts occurring in places where peaceful multilingual practice still occurs. And I'll get into the case of Cameroon a bit later, where this sort of explores some of these dimensions. So with all of that, how should we understand it? If it's not about policy, it's not about diversity, it's not about practice. My work seeks to identify language conflicts as a specific tool of political alienation and a representation of political autonomy. I see language and language policy as key moments of exacerbation in political conflict. So these key moments in process tracing where we have heightened moments of political conflict. And I also see political conflict as often expressed by language grievances. So we often see in broader political conflicts, folks expressing political autonomy through greater attachment to a language. Why is that the case? Why do I sort of adopt this logic of political conflict being connected to language conflict? My logic is sort of goes in this way. I see language as mattering a lot to states. States function through language policy and operate language policy as tools of inclusion and exclusion. And then historically, we see that the language policy choices of the state are connected to moments of conflict emergence and exacerbation. So some of my work looks into why does language matter to a state, and in sort of at least the European nationalist perspective, why do we think of language as being so closely tied to a state's logic of existence? You have some of the sort of philosophers of language and nationalism, such as Herder, thinking about language as being really closely tied to state identity through thinking about what makes a people, that it's not ethnicity, that language is really this expression of who a country is. But then I think, interestingly, you also have philosophers thinking about the role of language in the state as a functional one. So John Stuart Mill and Emile Durkheim thought of as a shared language as absolutely functional for any democracy to operate, both on a practical level, like we can't all vote if we don't speak the same language, but also in this idea that we cannot share political beliefs if we don't all speak the same language. And as the modern state developed, we saw language and then violently exported through colonization as adopting this function as both state function and national community, really serving this practical and imagined role, this resource and belonging, both administrative and nationalist. And some of the other logic here is that this makes language particularly dangerous for states. There's some logic that says states can choose to be sort of neutral on questions of ethnicity or religion, but that a state can never be neutral on language. And there's an administrative reality that a state always has to function in a language, and often the language that it chooses to function in exacerbates political tensions. Why do I think that operating this political conflict perspective helps us to understand language conflicts? I see it as helping us to understand conflict dynamics, understanding that often language may not be the most salient or the only marker of identity in a language conflict, but an expression of other conflict dynamics happening. I also see it in helping us understand conflict emergence, so being able to target these sort of moments where violent protests happen, and it can be these moments of exacerbation. And I also see it as sort of an optimistic logic, because we can look at more ways of how to solve language crises. Again, in some of these conflicts, and I'll talk about Cameroon in a moment, we have large policy concessions already in place, but it's really political solutions that are going to switch these language conflicts into peace. So I want to turn now to a case where I think we can really see these dynamics of language and politics and political autonomy at play. And that's the case of Cameroon's Anglophone crisis. So since 2017, separatists in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon have been fighting for a breakaway state, which they call Ambazonia. And this conflict is split on sort of historical territorial linguistic lines. After World War I, when the territory was controlled by Germany, it was split up into British administration and French administration. So majority of Cameroon functioned as a French colony, while the Anglophone regions would become the Anglophone regions were administered with Nigeria. In 1961, a referendum was placed to the Anglophone regions as to whether to remain with Nigeria or to rejoin a Republic of Cameroon. What is really interesting to folks who think about the dimension of language in Cameroon is that this referendum went one very particular way, and that was for Anglophone Cameroon to reassociate with the historical territory of Cameroon. There's a lot of politics about that referendum, which I will not get into at the moment, but happy to sort of in question moments. But those who think of language as sort of this is the marker of identity, we didn't see Anglophone Cameroon choose to remain with Nigeria, which would have been sort of that Anglophone connection. The current wave of the crisis began in 2016. Since then, over 6,000 deaths, displaced more than 700,000. Recent elections in Cameroon, which I'm also happy to talk about, have really only exacerbated this. And in 2025, the Norwegian Refugee Council named it the world's most neglected displacement crisis. Really haven't seen any movement on it, either from internal dialogue efforts or external mediation. So current wave of crisis, though it's been going on really since the 1961 referendum, was in 2016, and it was at this moment of specific language exacerbation. In 2016, lawyers, students, teachers were protesting and focusing on the marginalization of Anglophone professionals in government and law, focusing on mistranslation of laws, imposition of Francophone teachers in the Anglophone regions, lack of opportunity for English higher education throughout the country, and a lot more. As I mentioned, the conflict has had really devastating outcomes. It's also dragged on. We're entering about 8 years now and really no progress. The question I get a lot, though, when I talk about Cameroon in the context of language conflict is this even about language? And it's a fair question. What we see in the conflict, which again has touched on since the 1960s, really, is that there's waves of focus on language issues. There's not really a consistent linguistic narrative happening. In August 1994, which is again already 30 plus years into sort of Anglophone advocacy, the Southern Cameroon's National Council wrote in the Cameroon Post that our struggles are neither of an essentially linguistic character nor are they in defense of an alien colonial culture, but aimed at the restoration of the autonomy of the former southern Cameroons, which has been annexed by the Republic of Cameroon. So here you have in 1994 them saying this is not about language. This is really not about us speaking an English language. At the same time, you have these waves of protests that really are about language. In 1983, mass student protests over the sort of changes in high school exams between the English and the French language systems. Again, in 2016, a lot of advocacy around language issues. Second, while this conflict is sort of happening on a single linguistic divide, and we call it the Anglophone crisis, Cameroon is functionally really highly multilingual. English and French are more often used as second or third languages, and so we can't really adopt this perspective of sort of like an innate identity or an ethnic identity operating this crisis. And many Cameroonians are not fluent in either English or French. The Cameroon census estimated 29%, but not sure how accurate of a number that one is. The other really interesting thing that we see is that traditional assumptions of how identity-based conflicts don't entirely play out here. Violence has primarily been located in the Anglophone region, and most often we see separatists mobilizing and committing violence against folks in the Anglophone community themselves and in the region, mostly to enforce ghost town protests, which are to sort of boycott public life. And then we also see mostly violence against the state itself, so destruction of government buildings, attacks on troops. And throughout the conflict, there's sort of inconclusive evidence as to whether the Anglophone identity has strengthened. There are studies that show that in the Francophone regions, we don't see this sort of demonization of English speaking that you might expect from a language conflict. One study showed that Francophone parents in sort of the center of Cameroon were still sending their children to learn English at very high rates. So struggling to sort of think about whether or not this is a language conflict. But I think that adopting this framework of Cameroon's language conflict as a manifestation of a struggle for political autonomy is maybe more apt, understanding it as a manifestation of both a political resistance to a majority Francophone state and as moments of exacerbation. And this logic of identifying language as that moment of exacerbation can help us understand other conflicts that we think of as typically ethnic or territorial. Just one other quick example, Sri Lanka's civil war, which happened for 30 years, between a majority Sinhalese-speaking government and a Tamil minority, typically perceived of as an ethnic territorial conflict. But what we saw is that often moments of language policy were heightening moments of alienation. In the 1950s, the Sinhala Only Act, which was a discriminatory language policy against Tamil speaking, was one of these real moments that created a movement for political autonomy. So where is my research at right now, which is the more important question as a PhD student? Right now, I'm sort of focused on understanding what path a conflict takes to move it from sort of a language conflict that might be about revitalization efforts or symbolic efforts into one that really challenges a state and threatens the state. So doing sort of some early conceptual work around how to categorize language conflicts at sort of their demands and their goals. My current biggest challenge is trying to create a data set of linguistic conflicts. I would be very happy to know if anyone knows of some awesome data out there which categorizes conflicts as to how they think about language issues, but currently trying to focus on that. Also continued archival research, process tracing, and hopefully interviews soon to understand the relationship between political demands and language rights demands. And I have to give a real shout out to some super exciting work that's happening here because I'm hugely in admiration of it. So if my talk has convinced any of you that language conflict matters and politics and language matter, I hope that you get involved with this. I just wanted to sort of conclude with one of my favorite quotes from a French linguist. And so if this has convinced you that language and politics matter, if war is the continuation of politics by other means, then language policy is a civil war of languages. Once pacifist illusions are disposed of, it only remains for the linguist, in the course of carrying out his trade, to behave as a citizen and keep democratic watch on language policy at all times. So I hope all of you as linguists will keep democratic watch on language policy at all times and let me know what you find out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. We got time for discussion here. For those online, you can type in questions to the Q&A or in the chat if you want, or raise your hand if you want to ask a question here. In the room, anyone ready with a question to get us started? Looking at the language aspect.
I'm Florian Kern. I'm the Department of Government.
Yes, so nice to meet you.
And I'm also in the quoted MCCRA group.
Yeah.
There are a couple of us here. This is obviously super interesting for us because we also are in Cameroon and other countries, right? And so the first thing that that is also a problem that we're facing. Right? And every time I hear, when we think about language conflict in our group, we also use Cameroon all the time, but it seems so overdetermined in some ways, right? To make that selection of that case because it's so obvious that language is a part of it, right?
Yeah.
And I actually find it interesting that you were going into Sri Lanka and sort of other cases because I was kind of curious. Oh, is there going to be more? And you sort of stayed with it. And I'm wondering whether you have sort of other ideas.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like Cameroon seems to me so overdetermined to me because it's just so present as an issue that it's like, oh yeah, there must be, this is a language conflict. Or maybe not because it's like so much discussed that it must be.
Yeah.
So I think it would be helpful to go a bit more deeply into sort of other cases to make the case. I was also not entirely sure, and maybe you're not sure either, maybe that's fine, right?
Yeah.
Whether you actually now argued that there is language conflict or that there isn't, right?
Yeah.
And to be fair, like I think we're not even in the group, we're not like fully convinced of either. Like my take is also a bit of a political economy take, which is that, you know, you said it in the beginning, right? The distribution is very weird about like where conflict happens, where language is an issue, where it isn't, right?
Yeah.
So clearly I would argue that clearly it's an issue that the salience of which needs to be switched on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's sort of switched on by other things than language, but language is the where it gets expressed, right?
Yeah.
Where it's the arena where it happens, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know, like I guess the question would be, are you now of the opinion that there is like something like language conflict, or are you theorizing that it isn't and that it is an expression, that it is an instance of something?
Yeah. I think so. For me, what I don't want to do in my research, I'm going back far now, is to sort of deal with the issues that I think folks who look at religious conflict and ethnic conflict dive in. And to me, that's where research on language conflict gets into a point where I don't think it's helpful. Like if we get to the stage where we're saying, okay, Cameroon is a language conflict, it's not an ethnic conflict. Like Sri Lanka is a language conflict, it's not an ethnic conflict. There are massive issues in the field with sort of determining, okay, this conflict is about this conflict is about this. And it often involves sort of imposing our very specific understandings of what identity is, like on a conflict. And so for me, I guess it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I don't want to get to the point in our research where we say like, these are language conflicts, these are not, and there's nothing else going on. What I do want to do is understand sort of the mechanism of language. Like when is language the thing that's exacerbating stuff? When is it not? When are states making the choice to focus on language? When are they not? And so I think, you know, it's not a great answer, but I think it does sort of, for me, I think of it as an expression of conflict. I think of it as a tool of conflict. But I think we can make a distinct case for language conflict by saying this is the lens that we're focusing on. This is what we're understanding. I also completely see your point about we all focus on Cameroon, right? We say like it is the example of language conflict. But I think what I can hope that I point out here is that I don't think it's as simple as that. And some folks that I've spoken to have said, what are you talking about? Like Cameroon is not at all about language. This is about corruption. This is about political independence. And if you look at the course of the Anglophone movement, you know, in 1961, you had some of the leaders of what is now the Anglophone movement saying language is not the issue here. We're coming back together. These were colonial languages that were imposed, and we're optimistic that we can create a new Cameroonian identity. That didn't work because of a government that politicized language in a certain way. But I don't want to get to the point where we say sort of, multilingualism causes conflict. Monolingualism causes conflict. This doesn't. I just don't think that's reality.
Right. For that, just to quickly say this, I sort of we agree with this criticism a lot as well.
Yeah.
We find it just way too simplistic the way that we're measuring ethnicity by measuring which language someone speaks.
Yeah.
Right? Because people speak several languages.
Yeah.
And I also like what you say about Cameroon in the sense that you say like, oh, maybe it's not at all about language.
Yeah.
It's something else. It's like saying, I don't know, it's controversial to say this, but it's like saying Germany fighting Russia in the Second World War was a language conflict.
Yeah.
Because
there's two different languages, and there's
in Russian territory, right? It's obviously about something entirely different. What I found most interesting though, and I think I would lead into that a little bit by where you is that bit where you showed what other languages are actually spoken.
Yeah.
Because it actually shows that that dimension of English and French, right?
Yeah.
Is actually when you unpack it, is actually much more complex.
Yeah.
And how these different language groups then people who identify with these different language groups who speak very similar language, then group themselves into one or the other, right? I think that's where sort of what I find most puzzling.
Yeah, and I think too, what I sort of hope to lean into is understanding sort of when language difference sort of becomes language conflict. I think that's where we can be really helpful. And I think it's also what the goal of these sort of categories try to do, right? Understanding when does religious division become war? I just don't think the work is there on sort of language. So, and just quickly sort of on your point about other cases, Sri Lanka, for example, that's sort of where I'm working right now with trying to compile this data set of thinking. So are some of these conflicts that the literature has really just said, okay, these are ethnic conflicts. Can we look at those and find moments where language, like grievance, is actually the thing starting a protest or actually moving on? So that's the hopeful future work.
I'm going to jump to this online participant, Martha Burley, who works on research in multilingual mediation and rhetoric in Cameroon conflict reporting. So Martha, can you hear us? Can you ask your question?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Martha Multilingual. I'm a Commonwealth scholar at the University of Derby, and I am a Cameroonian. So when I saw the flyer about this presentation, I couldn't just afford to miss. I had to come to Oxford to meet Elena, but I was held with many other things here at the uni. But I couldn't afford to miss this presentation because it's around my area of study, and it's a topic which is really very dear to me. So my research focuses on the rhetorical techniques and the multilingual mediation in conflict reporting in the Cameroonian press. And I'm particularly looking at the Anglophone crisis as well. And so I'm basically examining how journalists use language. That is, it could be French, English, Pidgin, or maybe Franglais to shape public understanding, identify, for identity, and also the framing, and to see if the framing of grievance and the framing of the grievances in the conflict. So I really want to appreciate your presentation, and I would like to have your contact after this. But before I do, please, I would like to find out, in the context where speaking about the Anglophone grievances is often framed as threatening national unity or promoting separation, I'm interested to find out how journalists can, report on the conflict responsibly while still acknowledging the legitimacy of those grievances of the Anglophones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That is amazing research, and I'm in admiration of that. I would love to speak as well. Yeah, you're right. So, and often how sort of historically politicians in the Francophone regions have talked about this conflict is that, these are, separatists trying to destroy the unity of Cameroon, trying to destroy this sort of initial 1961 goal to have this bilingual country. I think journalists can report on it by talking about the fact that this is a long process. There's been many years of Anglophone activists attempting to have political concessions, to return to a federation, and to have political involvement, reforms in the education system. And separatism did not emerge really strongly until 2016. It's been a really long process. So I think the responsibility there sort of lies in speaking about how this conflict has really changed over time. There's still massive debate within Anglophone activism as to whether separatism is the way forward. But the reality is that political change has not been on the table, even as recently as 2018 major national dialogue. And so I think, I hope that we're sort of talking about language issues in relation to political advocacy can help, and talking about how this sort of interplays and splits into separatism eventually. But I would love to speak more, so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any more questions in the room? Charlie?
What's the threshold for when you're looking around the world, or when you start looking at a conflict? I'm thinking about the Indian context is the one that I'm most familiar with. There's tons of language issues and conflicts sort of that don't erupt or haven't erupted yet into violence, or the violence is so localized that it's not the only local papers are reporting on it.
Yeah.
But even other things like closer to here, like you look at Belgium or something, like there are countries that have lots of conflict, but it's like the French and the Dutch speakers in Belgium are not fighting each other necessarily, but nobody would say like that's a country that has no language conflict. And it's definitely in the political realm. It's just so how do people decide like we want to survey these places and not these other places?
It's hard, and that's sort of what I'm saying sort of the biggest challenge in thinking about this data set. It's also just a struggle with sort of what data is consistently out there, because in the political science field we have folks who like amass a data set that is sort of only conflicts that have this amount of deaths in this construction, or you have only conflicts that are maximalist and talk about the state, or only conflicts that are just sort of peaceful movements. And I think that studying language conflict has to take a really wide net in bringing those together. The other thing that I think is a challenge, which you point out rightfully so, is that some of these cases which we say are, okay, there's language, but it's peaceful, there actually are instances of violence. I think we forget sometimes, like in Quebec, there were terrorist attacks around language movements. Even in a place that we think of as really peaceful, like Switzerland, there's still debate over whether, one city in a canton is part of a German canton or a French canton. You have, there were separatist movements, small, in Switzerland at some point. So I think looking at language conflict also forces us to break some of those assumptions. Challenge with that is there's a lot of countries in the world, and there's a lot of countries to look at. So I'm currently sort of debating, do I sort of take like a massive list of countries and look at like, or do I break it down by language groups and see this? Do I more so look at violent conflicts alone? I don't have an answer. I would love any help on that, honestly. That's where I'm at.
Let's start here.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. I'm not a linguistic person, so
Me neither.
I don't know if the question makes sense or not. But you mentioned that language is important for state identity, and I was wondering if you came across something that said that has also been important in state building, like not just the identity but the process of state building. And how is this related to the current Anglophone crisis in the way that do they articulate their claims or their aspirations for autonomy and separation in a way that where language is manifested in their state building goals?
That question totally makes sense. And the short answer is yes. So you have everything from states as they emerge, one of their sort of key functions is often to standardize language. So when the French state was emerging, sort of, the first sort of standardization, you see it in sort of early state building efforts in China, you see it often, right? that creating a national identity, but also creating like administrative function comes from consolidating and standardizing language. I think what's also really interesting is that there's been sort of a rise. We see it in Britain, we see it in America. President Trump made English the official language in March 2025. It's never been the official language of the US. There never was a language policy. So even now, when we have these moments where states are trying to define the included and the other, it's happening through language policy. In Britain, there's massive discourse around, we all need to speak English or else we're strangers. It's still happening. It has happened. And for me, that's a key part of why we can say language even causes conflict, because it determines who's part of the state and who's not, both belonging, but also functionally. There's a very real reality. In Cameroon, we've heard sort of anecdotes of people attempting to get their birth certificates or government documents and having civil servants only speak French. And the way that is a very sort of a violent insult and a claim that you're not part of the state, and how that exacerbates conflict as well.
Very dumb, because I know nothing about this. I was struck with your slide that I thought, as the talk was going, that you were going to say that the Anglophone population was much smaller than the French-speaking population, and I was struck by the fact that they were very similar. 35% up, sort of.
Yeah.
So you're not talking about. I wondered whether with the sort of geographical and resource element to this, because you've got almost the same number of Anglophone speakers to Francophone speakers in a very small geographical region. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So geographically, it's about. And this is where it gets confusing, right? Because we say Anglophone, does that mean a territory? Does that mean a language we speak? Does that mean historical? Yeah.
I mean, I was sort of interested in two things. First of all, whether that has an implication, the fact that the populations are very similar.
Yeah.
But if you look at Catalan in Spain, Catalan obviously is an economically very wealthy part of Spain. So I think that also has a sort of determining factor. The economic reasons why there's this, also this division.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Anglophone regions, there's a really interesting dynamic here too, around colonization and relationship to former colonial regime. So Francophone Cameroon was always administered as a single colony. Anglophone Cameroon was administered as part of Nigeria. And sort of because of that, sort of claim is much lower economic development in the region, much less sort of formation of distinct political autonomy. And during the colonial period, when Anglophone Cameroon was part of Nigeria, there were massive efforts for political autonomy, even within that structure. So you see a lot lower economic development in that region, and continuing with the fact that there's fewer opportunities for higher education, this and that. But what is interesting, and what you point out, Catalan, with sort of economic issues, is that the Tamil conflict, after British colonization, Tamils during the colonial period were often part of sort of like government positions. The language was more widely spoken. They're more fluent in English. And so the Singla population framed sort of the Singla only act as sort of a reclaiming of a culture sort of in backlash to that. So yeah, all sorts of economic dimensions do play in. But I haven't figured out whether that's any predictor or not yet.
The fact that English is a lingua franca also an issue. I mean, is there a kind of feeling of if you speak English, there's a sort of advantage to that?
Definitely in the Sri Lankan case, but in Cameroon, what I think is very interesting is that, and I don't have any hard data on this, and I'm interested in exploring it more, is that because English is a lingua franca, you have many students in Francophone Cameroon wanting to learn English, but that English is not Anglophone Cameroonian, right? So there's like a very interesting play there, where we think about, okay, when is speaking English language identity, and when is it language tool? And that again complicates whether we think of this as a language conflict or not.
questions behind
Hi.
this improvement. Thanks so much, Elena. It's fascinating. Thanks for
Thank you.
being here. Thanks to the organizers. I'm Brian Phillips, also in the Department of Government at TMT's Area Project. I have a question, and I think maybe a suggestion on a question. You put up a table of types of movements.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if there's time, if you could discuss this a little bit, because it looks fascinating, but
Yeah.
there wasn't maybe enough time to go into that. So if you tell us a little bit about that, it's really interesting. That's the first. The second, but I think the big question of sort of what is language conflict, what are the language conflicts, and building on what I think Florian was saying a little bit, maybe it seems like you're suggesting that there are not conflicts that are only about language. And so even though it sounds like a really important concept, maybe it's a good starting point for the search. And maybe the sort of like subtitle or second part is it's not so much language conflict, but language aspects of conflict. And maybe among in the universe of conflicts, maybe mostly ethnic conflicts, there's sort of a degree, like to what extent are there is there language salience in this conflict, or language policies in the salient? Maybe that's something you could sort of analyze to look how there's variation across conflicts. And that's just sort of a thought, but I thought the table was really interesting.
No, that's really helpful. And I think I'm often torn between trying to frame my research as research about language conflict because I care about this research agenda and I sort of want to frame that research agenda, and being a bit more nuanced and accurate that's really helpful. This is a super rudimentary table and just sort of ways that I've been thinking about, trying to think about to what degree language has sort of moved into that political realm, because we see like language movements are not always sort of maximalist state challenging movements. So for example, sort of work on the Romansh language in Switzerland is more focused on like language revitalization efforts. It really doesn't take on this political character, more so focused on, encouraging parents to pass on the language to their children or continue to teach. And then we have some movements that look more like language advancing, so really focus on getting proclamations, protections, private rights. We see that in like movements for indigenous language rights a lot. But then I'm trying to think about sort of what happens that moves them into state challenging movements. And so state challenging I think of as really focusing on actual reforms to like education, to government and legal sectors. And that's where we saw the Cameroonian Anglophone crisis for a while, for like many years was in this realm of saying. And why I think of it as state challenging is sort of because of that idea that language is sort of key to state function. And then we see sort of the Cameroonian Anglophone conflict move into state threatening, which is focused on political autonomy, independence. So I haven't quite figured out whether I'll be sort of tracing language conflicts along this realm or more thinking about language aspects of conflicts, but wanted to sort of provide some insight into the very real thing that not all language movements are language conflicts.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really interesting, and really interested in your project more widely. I think a few things. So in the project, we've had a discussion of this idea of language conflict, and I think we spent some time recently with the rest of the team actually trying to move away from this as a term.
Yeah.
Because we don't have it in our project title, so we're interested in multilingualism, conflict resolution, but they're not language conflicts. And I think that's a sort of interesting thing that I hadn't thought of until we had that discussion in September.
Yeah.
I think a few of the things that you're thinking about. So, with the so-called kind of Anglophone, Francophone context in Cameroon, and I go with Warren, like one is naturally drawn to it. Yeah. But beyond, like, you could think of this as ethnicity. So beyond language and beyond thinking of Francophone and Anglophone, our Cameroonian colleague who is part of the project, who is currently in Cameroon, which is why she's not here, also people will say to her, "Oh, you dress in such an Anglophone way." Right, so this is, in other contexts, markers of ethnicity. It is behaviours, it is patterns, it's the food, it's the culture. And so we know that in Cameroon, it's not that all of the people under the label of Anglophone are part of particular ethnic groups and all. So we have, if you want, Cameroonian ethnicities cross-cutting Anglophone. But there is still strong perceptions within the country of Anglophone identities that go beyond English. Yeah. Right, and as you're saying, also beyond the geography of Anglophone, like what are we talking about? Yeah. And I think again, when you're talking about like the birth certificates and things, again, lots and lots of these anecdotes where people are speaking English and are told in French, "Oh, Cameroon's bilingual, like Cameroon bilingual." So meaning speak French, not Cameroon is bilingual, so speak either of these languages, or indeed any of the other languages, because Cameroon is not bilingual, it's multilingual, right? So I guess this comes from what you're pointing out, the feelings of marginalization, like in communities, and what Jesse is pointing out, also kind of the economic and sort of political power in that region.
Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting stuff there. So you've got layers, and in some way, an extreme option would be to say actually Anglophone and Francophone are ethnic identities.
Yeah.
And that's no different from thinking of ethnic conflict.
Yeah.
And a less extreme version, which is I think what we're trying to do, is separating what I think in a previous world we called linguistic diversity, which I'm not quite sure I'm happy with, and multilingualism. And for us, multilingualism is language practices. So not counting languages, but looking at how people use those languages.
Yeah.
And that could, of course, include English and French.
Yeah.
And of course, we're actually talking about Cameroonian English, Cameroonian French. And I think Martha was mentioned on Cam Franglais and Pidgin, Cameroonian English, all of those things being in that space.
Yeah.
So I don't know where that gets with your kind of
No,
mechanisms and the
yeah.
political but
yeah. I think no, you bring up really interesting aspects of this conflict. I think what is interesting to me is that, like, yes, multilingualism is the reality, like in most countries around the world, right? Like multilingualism happens, multilingualism is happening in this case. And in Cameroon, multilingual practice is the reality. And there's still a conflict that mobilizes around language. So I think to some extent there's like we have to detach like multilingual practice from what language looks like in conflict, because to me they don't seem to intertwine that much. And again, just going back to the Sri Lankan case, for hundreds of years, Tamil speakers and Sinhalese speakers were functioning in multilingual realities. You have reports from sort of courts of, poetry in Tamil or poetry in Sinhala, like multilingualism happening, and still conflict emerges. So I'm trying to balance sort of those two things. I think the other interesting thing you bring up is like, is Anglophonism and ethnic identity? And where I think I'm interested to do more research is around how the movement itself is framing it. There was one sort of survey I found, which the sort of Anglophone movement did, which was trying to count Anglophone speakers or things like that. And they had defined Anglophonism as people who had lived in the region from a certain moment in time. And so then you sort of think, well, okay, is it just a territorial identity, right? Is it just folks who experienced this form of colonization and this form of political attachment? So I think there's some work to do into understanding what the narratives are that FELBs and the ethnic component to it, which you bring up is part of that.
We have a final question.
I just have a quick, I hope just a few things, perhaps we'll have time to answer. I think the first thing is the understanding of conflict. Are you talking about, really the violent kind of conflict? Because you're talking about, again, other countries where there is some conflict there in terms of, languages, but it's not involving kind of violence.
Yeah.
And also in terms of, when you're talking about here language policies, but also political discourses, because I think I was going to ask her about the US, people really live in fear now because if they speak another languages, ICE come for them. Is it a kind of conflict going on there? The same in the UK. Nowadays I can see myself, the number of things I've seen, I'm quite mindful of speaking Portuguese or other languages, depending where I am. And so that kind of caused some kind of anxiety there. Is that to live in that kind of conflict?
Yeah.
So I think that's perhaps,
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's I approach this from specifically trying to understand moments where it escalates into violent conflict, which sort of maximalist goals. But I do think a broader perspective on conflict is helpful here, right? Like there are everyday injustices which function as conflicts, which can move into broader conflict. And I think that's a really interesting moment in the US right now, thinking about sort of, we haven't seen sort of massive mobilization around language rights in the US, and that's a tough kind, but broadly. But is this moment of sort of further injustices and further politicization going to move into broader conflict? There's a lot to think about. And then also the challenge where you have to eventually thin cases. You have to figure that out, which is like the torture of every sort of researcher is having to narrow down. But yeah, complete agreement that conflict takes a lot of forms. Yeah.
Because I was just in terms of if there's kind of a different perspective, if that conflict with an outsider, like during the fights for independence, and within the actual groups. Because I was just thinking of the case of Angola and East Timor,
Yeah.
and how Portuguese became
Yeah.
that mesh there when the
Yeah.
Indonesians prohibit Portuguese, and then Portuguese becomes the language that
Yeah.
resistance. They're trying to at the same
Yeah.
time be independent of Portugal. And the same in Angola, because they
Yeah.
come together, then after independence, that becomes a big thing between the groups. But Portuguese became the lingua franca to fight the colonizer. I thought that kind of amazing.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting case and one which I should look into more. I think what's exciting about this research is every time I speak about it, someone has a really interesting new case, and my framing of that is it means that this research is important. That's all.
Well, research is important, so that's a good note.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for coming. Later, we'll hang out for a while, once you can, or otherwise, we'll see you here in 2 weeks or online next week.